Welcome back, my friend. I'm glad you're here again, settling in, letting the day soften around you. So take a slow breath and let the world outside quiet down as we drift together into another gentle story from the old, faraway past. A story that moves softly like a calm tide at night. A story about two great nations, Britain and China, and how a tiny plant wrapped in sleepy fragrance slowly carried them toward one of history's most unusual conflicts. Tonight, we go back to the early 1800s, a time when the world moved at a different rhythm, a slower and steadier beat, when ships crossed oceans with tall sails, when letters took months to arrive, and when distant cultures felt like different planets. And in this slow-moving world, we find the vast land of China, ruled by the Qing dynasty, calm and confident, proud of its ancient culture and rich traditions. China, in those days, saw itself as a complete world on its own, a place of poetry, deep customs, and age-old ways that stretched back farther than memory. And far across the world, on the opposite edge of the great oceans, stood Britain, a rising empire filled with industry, smoky chimneys, spinning machines, and a growing hunger for trade. Britain was changing fast, almost breathlessly fast, while China still moved in an old, gentle stride. Imagine, for a moment, these two worlds in the early 19th century. Picture China, with its peaceful tea gardens, quiet river towns, long stretches of farmland, and busy markets shaded by old wooden signs. The smell of steamed rice drifting through narrow streets. The soft sound of silk brushing against silk as robes moved through morning crowds. A calm world, a rooted world. And now picture Britain, the rattling sound of carts, the soft clatter of tools, the hum of looms weaving cotton, and the distant pounding of new steam engines. A world filled with new dreams, new inventions, new desires. The two worlds were not enemies. Not yet. In fact, they barely understood each other. But they did trade. And in that trade, a subtle thread was slowly weaving its way into the story we're about to tell. China had something Britain loved, perhaps even needed. Soft, fragrant, calming tea. British households, from quiet cottages to grand estates, had fallen completely in love with it. Morning tea, afternoon tea, evening tea. It had become a sweet and comforting ritual across the land. But China at that time didn't want much from Britain in return. Chinese traders preferred to be paid in silver. And so Britain kept sending silver, ship after ship, across long distances, watching their reserves shrink with every passing year. This quiet imbalance worried British leaders. But the worry didn't come like a storm. It came slowly, like a soft mist creeping across a field. Little by little, British merchants, seated in quiet offices lit by candlelight, began wondering how they could turn the tide, how they could trade something China wanted just as much as Britain wanted tea. This question, this search for something valuable, would begin to shape the story ahead. And this search, gentle at first, would eventually lead Britain toward a plant with dreamy effects, a plant called opium. Back then, opium wasn't some dark word whispered in the shadows. It was a plant known for its soothing qualities, used in medicines, used in gentle remedies to calm aches and help restless people sleep. A plant with a soft scent, grown in warm fields under quiet sunlight. British merchants in India began noticing how valuable it could be. Not because China loved it at first, but because opium, once dried, pressed, and wrapped, could be carried easily across oceans. It didn't spoil. It didn't rot. It didn't break. And slowly, quietly, it found its way into Chinese coastal markets. But tonight, in this first part of our story, we aren't stepping into conflict or tension. We're simply drifting over the calm waters of the Pearl River Delta, where old Canton rested, one of the only places where foreigners were allowed to trade with China. Picture it, a warm evening breeze moving through the sails of anchored ships, gentle ripples gliding under wooden docks, lanterns glowing softly along the waterfront. A peaceful scene, a timeless scene. British ships arrived with cotton, wool, and metal goods, hoping to sell them. Chinese merchants, in their long robes, walked slowly along the piers, looking over the cargo with calm, thoughtful eyes. Sometimes they bought. Often they didn't. The balance of trade stayed uneven. And as the silver continued to pour out of Britain, something else quietly flowed in the opposite direction, almost unnoticed at first. Small chests of opium, carried by private traders, passed from hand to hand. No big announcement, no loud demand, just a quiet drift of a product that many wealthy Chinese smokers found relaxing, enjoyable, even soothing. Those early exchanges didn't look like the beginning of a war. They looked like ordinary business. A gentle transaction, a simple deal, a quiet handshake along a calm riverbank. And yet, with every soft puff of opium smoke inside a peaceful Chinese home, with every coin gently handed to a trader, the story slowly shifted, inch by inch. Not in a dramatic way, not suddenly, just like a slow tide rising over the sand. Far away in Britain, the people who ran the East India Company, sitting in elegant rooms with polished wooden tables, began to see numbers rising, profits growing, opium sales turning into a steady stream, and silver at long last flowing back toward them. In those early days, nobody thought this new trade would spark a battle between nations. Nobody imagined ships firing across quiet seas. Nobody pictured treaties being forced upon China. The world simply didn't look that way yet. It looked peaceful, so almost sleepy. China continued exporting tea, porcelain, silk, all the beautiful goods that Europe had come to love. And Britain, slowly and quietly, began solving its silver problem with opium sales. Not officially, not proudly, but steadily. In the Chinese countryside, life went on as it always had. Rice fields shimmered in the morning sun. Fishermen cast nets into calm rivers. Merchants opened their doors and swept dust from their thresholds. Families gathered for simple meals under warm lantern light. And behind this peaceful rhythm, opium pipes began to appear in more and more homes, not everywhere, not suddenly, but enough that a few local officials started to take notice. Small reports, written with careful brush strokes, made their way up the Qing government ladder. Reports that spoke of workers becoming slower, families spending too much money, and young men growing dependent on the dreamy comfort of opium smoke. These reports didn't carry panic, just concern, a gentle warning tone. Meanwhile, back in London, British leaders were thinking more about markets, trade routes, and the growing demand for Chinese tea. The excitement of profit whispered through the halls of power. And as long as money continued to come in, many minds stayed turned away from the quiet worry rising in China. This is where our story pauses for a moment, at a point where both nations still see only the surface of what is happening. Britain sees profit. China sees a product that is beginning to trouble its people. But neither sees conflict. Not yet. Imagine the world as it looked at this moment. Calm sea routes stretching across continents, ships gliding slowly across the water, carrying stories, hopes, rumors, and goods. News traveling so slowly that a problem might take weeks or months to reveal itself. This slow world gave everyone time to breathe, but it also gave problems space to grow without being noticed. And so, in the early 1800s, Britain and China were connected by tea, silver, and opium, all wrapped in the slow rhythm of old trade. The winds carried the scent of possibility. The rivers carried whispers of change. But everything still looked peaceful on the surface. Tonight, in this story, we stay in that peaceful moment, in the quiet before misunderstandings grow, before strong leaders step forward, before ships begin to circle China's coastline. We rest here, in a time when Britain and China were simply two nations trying to make sense of their needs, their desires, and their place in the changing world. A time when opium was still just a plant, and tea was still just a comfort, and trade was still just a set of quiet exchanges under lantern-lit docks. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, you can imagine the soft glow of those old lanterns, the warm hush of river waters at night, and the slow footsteps of merchants finishing another long day. A gentle world. A world drifting towards something neither side expected. And now, we will walk a little deeper into this story. It's always as the trade in opium grows, and the quiet balance between two mighty empires begins to shift, almost unnoticed. As we ease into the next gentle stretch of this quiet story, let your breath settle again. Nice and easy, like a small boat drifting along a calm river at dusk. We're still in that old world of the early 1800s, where news moved slowly, ships traveled at the pace of the wind, and life unfolded in long, unhurried steps. And now, in this part of our tale, we watch the opium trade not exploding, not rushing, but quietly spreading in a way that most people hardly noticed until it was already woven into everyday life. In the beginning, opium slipped into China almost like a soft whisper. British merchants working in India discovered how simple it was to prepare. Farmers would gather the poppy plants, slice the pods, let the thick sap dry under warm sunlight, and shape it into small blocks that looked harmless, almost ordinary. It didn't feel like something dangerous. It felt like any other trade good, easy to carry, easy to store, easy to sell. These early shipments were small. Sometimes the crates were tucked beneath rolls of cotton or tucked between sacks of spice. Sometimes they were carried by private traders who didn't think much about the bigger picture. They were simply trying to make a living. And for a while, the trade seemed too small to matter. But profit has a slow, steady pull, the kind that keeps a merchant awake at night, counting possibilities in the soft glow of candlelight. And when the British East India Company noticed how opium sales balanced their trade losses, they encouraged more cultivation in India. Not in loud speeches or grand meetings, but in quiet instructions passed down through offices, letters, and ledgers. Imagine those ledgers, thick books with worn edges, kept in dim rooms, filled with rows of numbers written in careful ink. Each number representing a shipment, each shipment representing a few more coins, and each coin pushing the trade a little further along. In India, fields of poppies began to grow wider, stretching under long, warm skies. Farmers worked slowly, their hands practiced and patient, tending the plants with daily care. By the time harvest season arrived, the countryside filled with the faint scent of poppy resin drying in the sun. Children helped gather the pods. Women shaped the sap into neat lumps. Men loaded carts for the journey to the coast. It all felt like ordinary farm work. Steady, simple, familiar. By the time the opium reached the ports, British traders were ready. The crates were loaded onto ships with tall sails, ships that creaked softly under the weight of goods. And then the wind carried them eastward, toward China, toward those quiet harbors near Canton, where merchants from many lands gathered to buy and sell. When the ships arrived, the goods didn't rush directly into the city. Foreign traders were restricted to certain areas, confined to special quarters along the river. They slept in rented rooms, ate simple meals, and waited for Chinese merchants to decide when business would begin. It was a slow dance, a patient one. But in these calm trade spaces, away from the eyes of strict officials, opium began finding buyers. At first, only wealthy Chinese smokers purchased it, thinking of it as a small pleasure, a gentle break from the long rhythm of the day. The pipes were made of bamboo or carved wood, shaped with simple beauty. People would gather in quiet rooms, sitting on mats, talking softly as they warmed the opium paste over tiny lamps. It didn't feel like trouble. It felt like a moment of calm, almost like taking a sip of wine or tea after a long day. But one thing about opium made the trade grow, slowly and steadily. Once people tried it, they wanted more. Not in a frantic way, not in an urgent rush, but in a slow, steady habit that brought them back again and again. Merchants noticed. They ordered more. British traders supplied more. And little by little, that small, quiet market began to widen. Far from the trade centers, in the heart of China, life looked unchanged. Farmers still woke before sunrise to tend the fields. Fishermen still cast their nets, hoping for a good catch. Children still played in dusty courtyards under the shade of old trees. And scholars still sat at wooden desks, dipping their brushes into ink, copying poems that had been written centuries earlier. No one in these lands knew that a new kind of dependency was slowly seeping into their country. They did not see the crates being unloaded in the night or the secret meetings between smugglers and traders. All they felt were faint ripples, stories of men spending too much money, families noticing strange behavior, young workers becoming less productive as the weeks went by. Meanwhile, in Britain, the trade looked like a simple economic solution. The tea wasn't going to pay for itself. And without opium sales, the British Treasury would continue losing silver at a pace that worried everyone from merchants to ministers. So, even though officials kept their involvement quiet, the trade grew with a kind of silent approval. Picture a British official in London, sitting in a polished office surrounded by maps and reports. He might tap his finger lightly on the desk as he read a letter from India, noting how opium production had increased. He might nod slowly, thinking about how that would help keep tea prices steady back home. He might think of the cups of tea enjoyed in every corner of Britain, from small stone cottages to the grand houses along the Thames. In those moments, the bigger consequences stayed hidden behind the comfort of familiar routines. Back in China, the Qing government remained mostly unaware of the deeper problem. Many officials believed opium was just a minor disturbance, something used by a few wealthy individuals, nothing large enough to threaten the empire. China had weathered countless changes over thousands of years. Why would a small trade item make any difference? But as the 1830s approached, the flow of opium quickened. Not sharply, not with any sudden leap, but steadily, like a river rising after a long season of rain. Merchants who once bought a little now bought more. Smugglers found new routes. Foreign traders discovered quiet coves where their boats could slip through unnoticed. In the villages, a different kind of story began to unfold. A father who once worked hard in the fields now spent long hours lying on a mat, lost in a dreamy haze. A son who should have been helping with the family business now wandered around with an opium pipe tucked beneath his robe. Money that should have gone toward food and clothing was quietly spent on smoke that drifted upward and disappeared. It wasn't everywhere, not even in most places. But the affected areas felt the weight of this new habit, a weight the emperor's advisors could no longer ignore. Yet even as these quiet troubles grew inside China, British merchants kept expanding their operations. They built warehouses along the coast. They hired agents who spoke local languages. They formed partnerships with Chinese middlemen. And they kept the opium flowing. All along the waterways around Canton, the trade created a strange kind of rhythm. Junks, the traditional Chinese boats, glided through moonlit channels carrying secret cargo. Foreign ships anchored offshore, waiting patiently in silence. Small rowboats moved between them, loaded with chests of opium packed tightly beneath tarps. Everything happened quietly, calmly, as though it were just another part of the natural movement of the sea. Some Chinese officials tried to stop the trade early on. They sent patrols to search boats, but smugglers found new hiding places. They punished small dealers, but powerful networks kept the supply chain moving. They raised taxes and issued warnings, but those warnings often drifted away unheard, lost in the larger noise of daily life. By this time, opium was no longer a small luxury for the wealthy. It had become something deeper, reaching farmers, laborers, soldiers, and clerks. A quiet force, pulling on the threads of society. Still, nothing felt like war. Nothing felt like a crisis. It was more like a soft shadow creeping across a bright room, changing things so slowly that people didn't realize how different everything looked until much later. And all the while, the British East India Company continued to benefit. Their ships returned home filled with tea, porcelain, silk, and other treasures that British families adored. They paid for these goods with silver earned from opium sales, feeling relieved, feeling balanced, feeling successful. No one knew the storm coming. No one saw the future in those early moments. We will move a little further, still slowly, still softly, as China's gentle worry grows into quiet concern, and the empire begins to see the deeper trouble hidden within those drifting clouds of opium smoke. For many years, the Qing Empire had lived with quiet confidence. China was vast, rich in tradition, and rooted in a history that reached back through countless dynasties. Officials believed the empire could handle almost anything, just as it always had. But by the 1830s, tiny signs of trouble began appearing here and there, scattered like little stones across a long path. Local officials started sending reports to the capital. These reports were written with careful brushstrokes, using calm but serious language. They spoke of young men who no longer worked as hard as before, workers who spent their coins on opium pipes instead of food, soldiers who seemed weaker, less disciplined, less steady in their duties. At first, these reports were small and easy to overlook. A single misbehaving soldier in a faraway town. A farmer who had sold too many belongings to pay for the dreamy smoke. A shopkeeper who had fallen behind on rent because of his habit. Individually, none of these stories felt alarming. China was enormous, with hundreds of millions of people. Problems came and went all the time. Why would anyone think opium, a substance that many believed was just a simple luxury, might become something bigger? But as the months passed, the reports became more frequent. A little village near Canton wrote of men spending their evenings in small smoke-filled rooms, leaving their chores unfinished. A trading town along the coast complained that people were borrowing money they couldn't repay. A military garrison reported that some of their younger recruits seemed unfocused, their minds drifting, their bodies tired. Still, everything felt calm on the surface. Markets stayed busy. Riverboats kept drifting down the wide stretches of the Yangtze. Farmers planted rice as they always had, their straw hats casting long shadows across the fields. Children still chased each other near the village wells. Life as a whole seemed steady and familiar. What China didn't see, at least not yet, was the slow spreading of something deeper. Opium pipes had found their way into quiet homes, tea houses, fishing huts, and even the private quarters of a few low-ranking officials. People used the drug not because they were reckless, but because it offered a moment of rest, a short escape, a warm, drifting comfort. It was tempting, soothing, a way to soften the edges of a long day. But with each use, it held them a little tighter. Far away in Beijing, the emperor's advisors sat in long halls decorated with red pillars and carved wooden screens. They read the incoming reports with calm expressions, trying to understand what was happening. Some dismissed the problem. Others whispered that the foreign traders must be stopped. Most remained uncertain. China had faced many challenges before, famines, rebellions, economic troubles, and had survived them all. Why would this be any different? Meanwhile, along the southern coast near Canton, the situation became harder to ignore. There, the foreign merchants stayed in their restricted trading quarters, their windows looking out over the Pearl River. They lived side by side with traders from other nations. waiting for business to begin each morning. And quietly, beneath the official rules and watchful eyes, the opium market continued to grow. Smugglers operated at night. The river, calm and dark under the moonlight, carried small boats back and forth. Junks loaded with hidden chests moved silently between larger ships anchored offshore. Sometimes the buyers were wealthy. Sometimes they were laborers pooling their money. And sometimes they were military men, even though it was strictly forbidden. Still, it wasn't open chaos. The trade brought tension, but not fear. Just a steady, creeping concern. Families began noticing changes in their loved ones. A father who once woke early to work in the fields now slept late. A brother who used to help with fishing became unreliable. A son who promised to manage the family shop spent too many evenings drifting in smoke-filled rooms. These changes weren't violent or dramatic. They were subtle, slow, quiet. And in a culture that valued harmony, discipline, and balance, even small changes felt unsettling. By the early 1830s, the Emperor Daoguang could no longer ignore the situation. He had grown up believing in the strength of his empire, in the order and wisdom of its traditions. But when thick bundles of reports began piling up on his desk, all pointing to the same growing issue, he felt a weight he could not easily shake. He gathered his advisors for long discussions inside the Forbidden City. They sat on cushions, sipping tea, talking softly but seriously. Some argued that China should simply adapt. Others insisted that the opium problem was being exaggerated. But many believed something had to be done, because allowing the trade to spread without control might harm the empire's strength, its discipline, and its people. The emperor listened, his face calm but troubled. He knew China's moral teachings looked down upon such substances. He knew that the drug weakened people over time. And he knew that allowing foreign traders to profit from this weakness felt deeply wrong. And so, gently at first, he took action. He issued orders banning the sale and use of opium. He instructed governors in coastal provinces to crack down on smuggling. He asked local leaders to punish those involved in the trade. These orders were carried out with the same deliberate, careful steps that defined Chinese administration. Officials posted notices on city walls. They sent patrols to search suspicious boats. They questioned merchants who were known to deal with foreigners. But the smugglers had grown skillful. They knew the waterways. They had networks of helpers. And British traders continued supplying the product, encouraged by high profits and steady demand. Each time the government tightened its grip, the smugglers slipped through new openings. And as they did, the emperor's gentle worry deepened. Some Chinese officials, especially those stationed near Canton, began speaking more boldly. They wrote stronger reports, urging the emperor to take tougher action. They warned that the drug was harming soldiers, draining silver from the economy, and spreading a kind of quiet weakness among the people. And as these warnings grew louder, though still polite and respectful, the emperor searched for someone strong enough, wise enough, disciplined enough to take charge of the crisis. Someone who would not be swayed by bribes, pressure, or fear. Someone who could stand firm against both local corruption and foreign influence. This search, though simple in appearance, marked a turning point. for it was during this time that the name Lin Zexu began to rise within the imperial court. A man known for honesty, for clear thinking, and for a steady, unshakable moral center. But we are not there yet. We remain in the quiet stage, where concern is rising like a slow morning mist, where the emperor is still deciding, still weighing the choices before him. Back in the villages, life went on. Women washed clothes by the river. Children chased each other through narrow alleys. Market vendors called out softly as they arranged fresh produce under colorful umbrellas. From afar, everything looked unchanged, almost timeless. Yet beneath this calm surface, a tension was forming. A gentle one, but real. The kind that comes when a whole society begins to feel out of balance. And in that imbalance, the emperor sensed the need for a stronger response. The people didn't know it yet. The foreign merchants didn't expect it. And the smugglers didn't fear it. But China was slowly preparing to take a clear, firm stand. Tonight, we pause here, in that quiet moment when concern becomes determination, when the empire begins turning its attention toward the opium trade, and when the first steps toward conflict quietly take shape, even if no one sees the storm on the horizon. And in the next part, we will meet the man chosen to face this growing crisis. A man who believed deeply in duty, discipline, and the moral strength of his nation. A man whose actions would bring China and Britain closer to confrontation than ever before. As we continue this slow and gentle walk through history, dear friend, let your mind settle even further and let your breathing fall into a warm and steady rhythm, because tonight we drift toward another quiet turn in this long river of events. The world of the mid-19th century felt calm on the surface, but beneath that quiet, many tides were shifting, and each tide carried people who never imagined how deeply their lives would be changed. In China, the concern over opium had grown into something far larger than a simple policy matter. It had become a question about dignity, order, and the safety of families across a vast land. And in Britain, a very different sort of idea was spreading, an idea wrapped in commerce, pride, and the belief that their ships and their trade should never be refused. So tonight, let us keep moving softly and slowly as we enter the next stage of this unfolding story. After Lin Zexu's strong actions in Canton, the British merchants felt trapped, angry, and helpless. They wrote letters to officials back home, describing their losses, their worries, and the destruction of the opium chests that had once promised them steady earnings. Many of those merchants felt not only frustrated but insulted, because their goods had been taken and destroyed by a foreign government without compensation. And when those letters reached London, they met a government already facing its own political storms. There were debates in Parliament, calm on the outside yet heated beneath the surface, as representatives argued about responsibility, fairness, and the future of British trade in Asia. Some leaders in London believed Britain had been wronged. They said that British property had been destroyed and that the empire's honor demanded a firm response. Others thought the situation was not so simple. They questioned whether it was right to protect a trade built on a drug that caused addiction across an entire nation. These voices argued that Britain should reflect, not fight. But even their gentle reasoning struggled against louder calls for decisive action. And slowly, The mood in London moved toward the thought that force might be necessary, not because of the drug itself, but because of something deeper, the belief that British traders must have the freedom to reach markets wherever they wished. As months passed, ships were prepared and officers received their orders. The British government planned a naval expedition, not very large, but powerful enough to pressure China without the need for a vast army. These ships were fitted with cannons, sails, sturdy hulls, and crews used to long voyages across rough seas. The officers believed they were setting out on a mission that would be settled quickly, perhaps through a show of strength rather than a long campaign. At the same time, most of them knew very little about China. They had read reports, heard rumors, and seen drawings, but the empire itself remained something distant, mysterious, and unknown. Meanwhile, in China, whispers began to spread about the possibility of conflict. Some expected negotiation. Others feared something more serious. The Qing court in Beijing received messages from Canton, warning that the British might arrive with warships. But the court had grown used to dealing with smaller maritime quarrels over the years. They believed that if foreign trouble appeared, it would be handled locally without disturbing the harmony of the empire. The emperor, concerned but calm, thought the British would eventually accept Chinese laws, especially now that the opium trade had been so firmly punished. But life along the coast was beginning to change. Fishermen saw unfamiliar silhouettes on the horizon, shapes that did not match ordinary merchant vessels. Harbor officials tracked strange movements across the water, and scholars in Canton wrote quietly in their journals, recording their unease with the world beyond the Pearl River Delta. Yet daily life continued with its usual rhythm. Markets opened every morning. Families gathered around warm bowls of rice. Distant ships were the concern of officials, not ordinary people living gentle routines. It was within this gap, between daily life and rising international tension, that the story slowly widened. The British fleet, making its long crossing from India and other ports, sailed with a calm determination. The sea winds were steady, and the ships moved smoothly across the water like floating islands. Officers studied maps, practiced drills, and waited for news. Some talked about China with curiosity. Others spoke confidently, believing that a small but modern fleet could handle whatever resistance they might meet. They trusted their cannons, their discipline, and their experience in naval warfare. Still, not everyone on board felt bold. A few sailors wrote in their diaries about their mixed feelings. Some wondered why they were sailing so far from home to settle a dispute over a drug they had never even seen. Others missed their families, imagining the gentle lights of London streets or the quiet fields of the English countryside. They hoped the mission would end quickly so they could return home without the long shadow of war hanging over them. When the ships finally approached the Chinese coast, the view was peaceful: green hills, calm waters, small villages, and distant pagodas standing still against the sky. To British eyes, the coastline seemed serene, almost like a painting. There was no sign of hostility, no sign of armies gathering, no sign of fear. Just the quiet movements of daily life in a land that had existed long before their own nations had taken shape. But even peaceful scenes can hide deep tension. Chinese officials had been alerted to unusual movements at sea, and they carefully watched the coastline. Some believed the foreign fleet would try to force new trade demands. Others hoped the British had come to negotiate, not fight. Messages were sent up the chain of command, and requests were made for guidance, but responses moved slowly, trapped in the long routes of imperial communication. As the ships anchored offshore, the British officers waited for Chinese negotiators, hoping to present their demands for compensation and expanded trade. But Chinese officials hesitated. To them, meeting foreign representatives under pressure felt like a challenge to their authority. And so the first quiet misunderstanding began. Each side expected the other to take the first step. The longer the silence lasted, the more uneasy the British officers became. They had traveled far, under orders to secure recognition and compensation. Waiting without progress made them anxious. They did not yet know that this delay was shaped not by insult but by the slow and formal structure of the Qing government, where decisions required careful consideration and respectful procedure. Around this time, small encounters began to happen. Boats from the British fleet attempted to approach the shore, only to be turned back by Chinese guards. Messages were exchanged, but they were vague and polite, carrying no firm commitments. Each side believed the other was refusing to cooperate, when in truth both were simply waiting for clear authority or safe conditions to speak. This quiet back and forth gave the whole situation a strange stillness, like two travelers waiting at opposite ends of a long bridge, each expecting the other to begin walking first. And during this pause, life carried on. Children in nearby villages played along the water's edge. Fishermen cast their nets and pulled in their evening catch. The world kept turning, unaware that two empires were slowly drifting toward conflict. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the emperor's court received more reports about the British fleet. Advisors disagreed about the best course of action. Some said diplomacy was the wiser choice. Others argued that showing strength would remind the foreigners of their place. The court was cautious, even uncertain, not because they feared the British, but because the Qing dynasty faced challenges at home, and foreign affairs felt like only one part of a much larger picture. In London, new letters arrived from the fleet. They described the delays, the tension, and the sense that China was refusing to negotiate. These reports slowly nudged the British government toward a harder stance. More ships were prepared, more officers were assigned, and pressure grew to settle the matter through force if diplomacy failed. Yet even with these preparations, nothing had erupted. No battles had been fought. No shots fired. Only a slow increase in frustration, a rising tide that moved quietly but firmly. And so, with all these slow, gentle steps, this period of waiting, misunderstanding, and miscommunication moved the world closer to a moment when calm would give way to conflict, not through anger alone, but through decisions made far apart, by leaders who never sat in the same room, never shared the same table, and never fully understood the other's hopes or fears. The British fleet remained along the Chinese coast, floating like a line of calm shadows on the water. Days passed, then weeks with little progress. Officers paced the decks, watched the shoreline, and wondered why talks had not begun. They believed that China was avoiding them on purpose. But from the Chinese perspective, things looked quite different. Officials were still sending messages to higher authorities, asking for guidance, hoping for clear instructions on how to handle these foreign ships with their confident sails and unfamiliar demands. In the cool evenings, Chinese coastal villages lit small lamps, letting their warm glow dance across the quiet waves. Fishermen returned from long days at sea, pulling their boats ashore, unaware that powerful ships waited just beyond the horizon. To them, life looked mostly the same. The winds changed, the tides shifted, and families continued their routines as though nothing unusual was happening. But the air carried a gentle heaviness, a feeling that something out of sight was gathering shape. On the British ships, the officers held regular meetings, trying to decide how patient they should remain. Some believed there was still time for negotiation. Others thought that delay showed disrespect. And slowly, the idea began to grow that a stronger signal was needed, not a full battle, but a display that would show China the seriousness of British intentions. They believed such a display would lead to quick discussions and a peaceful settlement. They did not imagine it would open the door to something larger. Far away in Beijing, court advisors debated how the empire should respond. Some argued that China held the moral high ground by banning opium and punishing those who traded it. They believed the emperor's position was clear and that foreign traders must accept Chinese laws. Others worried that these British ships might not leave so easily. They wondered whether a firm stance might lead to a conflict China had not prepared for. But the court moved at its own calm pace, trusting that time would bring the foreigners to respectful behavior, as had happened many times in the past with other nations. In Canton, Lin Zexu continued his work, enforcing the ban on opium with determination and dignity. He wrote letters to foreign governments, explaining his people's suffering and asking them to stop the trade. He hoped moral reasoning would be enough. He believed that any nation with compassion would understand the importance of protecting families from addiction. But his letters traveled slowly, and the British government interpreted his actions as refusal to treat them as equals. The gap between the two worlds widened gently, step by step, like a river quietly changing its course. As summer deepened, the British fleet began moving farther along the coast, searching for a point where they might open negotiations or show their strength without harming civilians. The air was warm, the sea soft, and the ships moved with steady grace. Chinese coastal defenses were spread thin, built for a different kind of threat, designed to face pirates and local disturbances rather than modern naval guns with long reach and strong recoil. Small encounters began once more. Sometimes the British sent small boats toward the shore carrying messages. Chinese guards, unsure of the visitors' motives, waved them away. The British interpreted this as rejection, while the guards believed they were simply following instructions to keep foreigners at a distance until the court responded. Each small moment carried a quiet misunderstanding, and each misunderstanding settled into the growing space between the two nations. Finally, after long waiting, British leaders decided to act. They planned a small operation meant not to cause destruction, but to clear what they saw as obstacles to communication. They believed that if they seized a few strategic points, China would quickly agree to negotiate. Their confidence came from their experience in earlier conflicts, where speed and firepower often brought swift results. Yet they did not fully understand China's system, where decisions moved through layers of officials, each bound by tradition and duty. The first British action came near the mouth of the Pearl River, where the empire's coastal forts kept watch. These forts were not heavily manned, and the soldiers stationed there were not expecting such modern artillery. When the British ships approached, they sent signals requesting talks, but received no answer. Again, misunderstanding played its silent role. Chinese officers believed the ships were testing boundaries. British officers believed the forts were ignoring them. When the first shots were fired, they echoed softly across the water, not loud enough to shake the world, yet strong enough to change the path of history. The British ships used their advanced cannons, striking the forts with precision. The Chinese defenders, brave and loyal but equipped with older weapons, returned fire as best they could. Smoke drifted upward, carried by the warm breeze, and the sound of the guns rolled across the waves like distant thunder. The battle did not last long. The British firepower overwhelmed the defenses, and soon the forts fell silent. No large loss of life occurred, yet the meaning was immense. The signal had been sent. The British believed negotiations would now begin. But in China, news of the attack brought confusion, disbelief, and sorrow. Officials could not understand why a foreign nation would use force over a banned drug. It felt like a storm that had no clear cause. As the reports reached Beijing, sadness filled the court. The emperor learned that foreign ships had attacked Chinese defenses without warning. To him, it seemed like an act of aggression against a land that had shown fairness and patience. He had believed his empire's moral stance would be respected. Now, he faced a conflict he had not sought and did not welcome. Across the fleet, British officers expected the Chinese to respond quickly. They thought an envoy would arrive any day to begin negotiating compensation for destroyed opium, recognition of British trade rights, and new conditions of exchange. But days passed with no word. Instead, coastal officials sent messages to the court requesting guidance, while others tried to strengthen defenses for the possibility of further attacks. The quiet machinery of the Qing government moved steadily but not swiftly, shaped by long tradition and careful deliberation. As summer days faded toward autumn, the British fleet resumed its movements. They sailed to strategic points, sometimes facing light resistance, sometimes meeting none. Their goal was to apply pressure without provoking a large war. But even pressure, when misunderstood, can lead to deeper conflict. Chinese villagers watched the ships pass from a distance, unsure what these tall foreign vessels intended. Elders whispered old warnings about outsiders, while scholars tried to make sense of these new challenges. In Britain, newspapers reported small victories, describing the fleet's success in calm and steady tones. Readers pictured the conflict as distant and limited, something that would be settled with little trouble. Few understood the deep cultural divide that shaped every message, every meeting, every silence. The tone of the reports made the situation seem simple, yet simplicity was far from the truth. In China, the emperor issued new orders to defend the empire's dignity. He called for discipline, caution, and unity. He wanted peace, but he also wanted respect. And to him, allowing foreign traders to dictate terms felt unacceptable. He believed China's long history, its traditions, and its moral values should guide its actions, not pressure from a distant nation. And so, slowly and gently, this quiet disagreement matured into a larger struggle. The British believed China would yield under pressure. China believed the British would eventually show courtesy. Both nations waited for the other to change. Both nations were guided by different expectations, shaped by different worlds, and separated by vast cultural distances. As the warm breeze moved across the calm sea, carrying the scent of salt and distant villages, the story drifted forward, toward a conflict neither side truly sought, shaped by choices made far apart, in rooms lit by lantern light and in offices across oceans. By the time the first scattered clashes had reached both capitals, Britain and China were already moving toward a path neither truly wished for. The British government, confident in its navy, believed that limited pressure would lead to quick compromise. They did not seek a long war. They simply expected China to open its ports, repay the losses from the destroyed opium, and allow British merchants to trade more freely. To them, these things felt normal, even reasonable, shaped by their own ways of thinking. But to China, those expectations touched something deeper. The Qing dynasty had always viewed foreign trade as something that should remain controlled, respectful, and properly defined. Allowing outsiders too much freedom felt like losing balance, like letting the walls of the family home open too widely. So even as news of the early battles reached Beijing with sadness and surprise, the court felt a duty to respond with calm strength, believing that the empire could not bend simply because another nation carried stronger ships. Along the coast, Chinese troops began preparing for more encounters. They were dressed in traditional uniforms, holding weapons that had served the empire well for generations. Their leaders were loyal and brave, though they knew little about the new kinds of firepower the British possessed. Still, they believed that courage, discipline, and unity would guide them, as they had guided their ancestors many times before. At the same time, the British fleet continued moving along the shoreline with patient purpose. The officers studied the land, observed the flow of boats around the river mouths, and took note of small fortifications. On quiet nights, the crews could hear faint sounds from distant villages, the soft bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through bamboo, the crackle of hearth fires burning in simple homes. These gentle noises reminded them that ordinary people lived close by, people who had nothing to do with politics or trade disputes. This thought weighed heavily on some sailors, adding a damp, reflective calm to their long nights at sea. When the British ships approached another defensive position along the coast, they sent messages once again, hoping to open talks. But the Chinese officers on shore believed these signals were tricks, meant to distract or confuse them. They responded by strengthening their positions. This quiet cycle repeated several times. Signals sent, signals mistrusted, no shared language, no shared understanding, no bridge between the two sides. The misunderstandings were small, but each one became another stone laid in the slow, rising path to conflict. Eventually, the British commanders decided they could wait no longer. They believed that action, not words, would bring China to the table. And so, After sending final warnings that never reached the intended officials, they prepared for another attack. On the morning the cannons were fired, the sea air was unusually calm, almost peaceful, as if unaware that the day would shape many futures. The exchange did not last long. British firepower was stronger and more accurate, while Chinese defenses were brave but outdated. The defenders fought with honor, doing everything they could, but the tide of technology had shifted too far. When the smoke cleared and the noise faded into the wind, British officers believed they had delivered a clear message. They expected negotiations to begin soon, now that they had shown their resolve. But far inland, when word traveled to Beijing, the emperor and his advisors felt something different, a quiet, heavy sorrow. They could not understand why a foreign power would use such force over a banned substance that harmed Chinese families. To them, China had acted with moral reason. To Britain, China had interfered with trade. In that gap, the seeds of wider conflict were gently planted, and neither side saw the roots growing beneath them. Meanwhile, in Canton, the city where much of this story began, tension slowly thickened like evening mist gathering at the edge of the river. Merchants felt uneasy, unsure which ships were safe to approach. Local officials worried about maintaining order as rumors spread. Families whispered across dinner tables, wondering whether the conflict would drift closer or fade away. And through it all, Lin Zexu continued to write letters, urging the emperor to stay firm in protecting the people from opium. He believed that standing for the health of the nation was worth whatever pressure arrived from overseas. The British commanders, encouraged by their early victories, soon prepared for a larger move, one that would show their determination even more clearly. They planned to sail farther north, toward the major approaches that connected China's interior to the outside world. They hoped this would bring China to negotiations more quickly, allowing both sides to settle their dispute before it spread too widely. As the fleet sailed north, the coastline stretched out like a long, unfolding scroll. Villages appeared and faded along the water's edge. Small ports bustled softly with fishing boats, and the air carried the gentle scent of salt, mud, and distant cooking fires. It was a peaceful landscape, one that gave no hint of the larger tension forming just beyond sight. When the British ships reached a major river mouth leading toward important cities, they faced another set of Chinese defenses. These were larger than the earlier ones, with higher walls and more soldiers. The officers on both sides felt a mix of duty and uneasiness. Neither group truly wanted bloodshed, yet both believed they needed to stand firm. British commanders sent a message demanding passage. Chinese commanders refused, believing they were defending the integrity of the empire. Again, misunderstanding shaped every moment. The British thought the refusal was a challenge. The Chinese believed the demand was disrespectful. Once more, cannon spoke before words could bridge the gap. The sound echoed across the waters, rolling through the warm air, startling birds from their nests in the reeds. When the smoke settled, British forces had taken control of the area. Chinese troops withdrew with heavy hearts, knowing they were brave, yet forced to face weapons far beyond their own. As news of these events traveled inland, a deeper realization settled within the Qin court. This was no brief quarrel. This was something the Empire had not faced in recent memory, an opponent with powerful ships, long-range guns, and a very different view of trade and diplomacy. The Emperor, wrapped in layers of silk and responsibility, felt the weight of the moment. He wanted peace, yet he believed he must protect the dignity of the Empire. But each delay, each refusal, each misunderstanding pulled the two nations further apart. Back on the British ships, some officers felt confident, believing they had nearly achieved their goals. Others felt quiet worry. They wondered whether China truly understood what Britain wanted, and whether continuing the campaign might bring more resistance instead of resolution. The sailors, drifting through these long days at sea, watched the coastline and wondered about the people living just beyond the horizon, people whose lives were now tied to decisions made far away by leaders they would never meet. Coastal towns began to feel the effects of the conflict. Trade slowed. Travel routes grew uncertain. Some villagers moved inland, seeking safety, even though they did not know what shape the conflict might take. Others stayed, trusting that the Empire would protect them as it had for centuries. Still, negotiations did not come. Each side waited for the other to bend, and day by day, the gap widened. With the softest steps, this quiet series of choices carried the world toward a fuller war, not out of hatred, not out of anger alone, but out of distance, confusion, and expectations that could not meet in the middle. As we come back to this quiet, drifting tale, dear friend, let yourself settle once more into the slow rhythm of the story, almost like sinking into a soft blanket as the night grows still around you. We have followed Britain and China through small clashes and long misunderstandings, through signals missed and messages delayed, through moments where neither side intended harm, yet both drifted steadily into deeper conflict. Now, we continue gently into the part of the story where the struggle spreads, not with sudden force, but with a long, heavy movement, like a slow storm rolling in from a far horizon. By the time the British fleet secured several positions along the coast, a feeling of inevitability had begun to settle over both nations. The British commanders believed their strength would soon push China toward negotiation. They spoke in calm tones during their quiet meetings aboard the flagship, reviewing maps by lantern light, tracing coastlines with steady fingers, imagining the next steps. They felt confident, yet a small unease lingered beneath that confidence. A quiet whisper that perhaps China would not respond the way they expected. Meanwhile, in China, the Emperor and his advisors studied each report with growing sadness. The news came slowly, carried by couriers who rode long distances across country roads, through towns that had no idea a conflict was unfolding far from their fields and riverbanks. The court learned that more forts had fallen, that defensive lines were bending, and that foreign ships were approaching important river systems. They believed they must stand strong, for the sake of the Empire's dignity and the well-being of the people. Yet they also feared the reach of this unfamiliar power whose reasons felt so foreign to them. As summer slipped toward autumn, the British fleet moved farther north, toward one of China's busiest waterways. The sea was calm, the sky wide and pale, and the ships glided like slow shadows upon the surface. The sailors kept watch from the decks, listening to the creak of ropes and the steady rhythm of the waves brushing gently against the hulls. Some wondered whether peace might come soon, perhaps with a treaty that would satisfy everyone. Others sensed that more fighting lay ahead, even though no one wanted to imagine it. When the fleet reached the entrance to a major river, they found it defended by a chain of strong fortifications. These forts rose from the shoreline like quiet guardians, built of stone and earth, shaped by centuries of Chinese engineering. Inside them, soldiers prepared themselves with disciplined determination. They polished their helmets, checked their weapons, and recited their duties in low voices. Many had never seen a foreigner up close. To them, the approaching vessels looked like strange visitors from a distant world. The British officers sent another formal message, asking for the passage of their ships and for discussions to begin. But the Chinese commanders refused. They believed protecting the river meant protecting the heart of the empire. The message they sent back was firm yet respectful, written with the careful brushstrokes of tradition. They stated that the foreigners could not enter without imperial approval. As with so many earlier moments, neither side fully understood the other. The British saw the refusal as defiance. The Chinese saw the demand as improper. And so, in that quiet gap between two worldviews, the stage was set for another clash. When the British fleet opened fire, the sound broke the morning air, rolling across the water in long, echoing waves. The Chinese defenders responded quickly, manning their cannons and firing with courage. The battle lasted longer than earlier ones, with thick smoke rising above the river mouth, drifting slowly over the water like a heavy curtain. The Chinese soldiers fought bravely, shouting orders to one another, moving with determination, believing they were holding back a threat to their homeland. But the British weapons reached farther and struck with more force, and after hours of struggle, the forts fell one by one. When the fighting ended, the British took control of the river entrance. Officers walked along the quiet shore, examining the damaged walls, the scattered stones, and the abandoned cannons. They felt a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. They believed they had made progress, yet they also saw the heavy cost of the day, the sadness left behind, the lives changed forever. Some wondered why negotiations had not begun much earlier, long before these battles became necessary in their eyes. In the Chinese capital, the emperor received the news with a solemn heart. The reports described bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice, but they also revealed the painful truth. The empire was facing a powerful force with technology far beyond its current reach. Advisors debated what to do next. Some urged negotiation. Others insisted on fighting until the empire's dignity was preserved. The emperor listened to each voice, feeling the weight of millions resting on his decisions. Lin Zexu, whose strong moral stance had begun this chain of events, wrote letters expressing deep concern. He believed the empire must hold firm in protecting its people from the harm of opium. But he also knew that the conflict had grown larger than any one issue. He felt caught between the call of duty and the desire to limit suffering. He remained committed to his principles, even as the situation grew heavier around him. As the British fleet slowly moved farther upriver, the landscape changed. They passed small towns nestled along the banks, where fishermen stood on narrow wooden boats, pushing through the water with long poles, watching the tall foreign ships with quiet uncertainty. Children on the shore pointed at the vessels, whispering guesses about who might be on board. The river carried these gentle scenes forward, wrapping the moment in the timeless rhythm of everyday life, even as history shifted around it. The British advance continued in a steady, measured way. Each time they encountered resistance, they responded with the same combination of patience and firepower. They believed they were pressing toward a resolution, but each step created new wounds across the empire, new ripples in the lives of people who had no part in the decisions that shaped their world. In many Chinese towns, people gathered in tea houses and marketplaces to share news. Some spoke with worry, others held on to hope. They trusted their leaders to find a path forward. They believed the scale of the empire, its long history, and its deep cultural roots would help it overcome the foreign presence along the coast. British officers, meanwhile, discussed the conflict during quiet evenings on deck. They spoke about strategy, diplomacy, and next steps, but sometimes their conversations drifted into softer subjects: the beauty of the coastline, the dignity of the Chinese forts, the bravery of the defenders they had faced. Some wondered privately whether the conflict could end through dialogue rather than continued force. But the momentum of events was moving steadily now, guided by orders sent from faraway capitals. As autumn deepened, the British achieved a major victory by capturing a vital city near the river. This city was a center of trade and a place of great importance. The capture was not as violent as many feared, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. British flags rose above key positions, and officers set up temporary headquarters in old buildings that had once housed local officials. The news spread quickly inland, carried by travelers, merchants, and messengers. It reached farms, villages, and mountain passes. It reached scholars sitting in quiet rooms filled with scrolls. It reached elders who remembered older times and wondered what this new chapter meant for the future. The emperor's advisors urged decisive action. Some called for a large counterattack. Others suggested negotiating before things grew worse. The court felt divided, stretched between pride and fear, between tradition and the shifting realities of a changing world. Meanwhile, on the riverbanks, simple moments continued quietly: fishermen pulling up nets, women washing clothes on smooth stones, children chasing each other through narrow alleys. Life moved on, even as the world changed around it. The conflict, though vast and heavy, touched these lives only through distant sounds, passing rumors, and subtle changes in the flow of trade. British commanders believed they were close to ending the conflict. They hoped China would soon agree to their terms. But China believed the empire must show resilience, that surrendering too quickly would weaken its standing. And so, the struggle continued, slowly, steadily, with each side shaped by its own worldview. As the sun set across the quiet landscape, casting a soft golden glow across the river's surface, the story of the Opium War continued to move forward, not through sudden turns, but through long, gentle currents shaped by duty, misunderstanding, and the slow drift of history. The long conflict that had wandered across coastlines and river mouths slowly drew toward an ending. And as we drift into this next part of the story, let's move gently, almost like we're floating across a quiet harbor at dusk. The air is soft, the light is dim, and the sounds of old ships creaking in calm water feel distant and low. After years of steady pressure, after long stretches of waiting and drifting and sailing, both Britain and China reached a moment where words had to replace gunfire and agreements had to replace the long, heavy rhythm of war. It was a moment shaped by exhaustion, by need, and by a quiet understanding that the tide could not turn back on its own. The Qing Empire had weathered repeated losses, not because its people lacked courage or spirit, but because the weight of British ships, British cannons, and British movement had been too strong, like a slow wave that kept rolling forward no matter how many stones stood in its path. British forces had taken key coastal cities, had sailed deep into the river systems, and had shown again and again that their naval power was something China had never trained to face. So by the early 1840s, China stood in a place where the war felt less like a battle and more like a draining storm, the kind that lingers for days until the land needs stillness more than anything else. In that soft, tired atmosphere, British envoys and Chinese officials began to speak. Not loudly, not with fury, but with the quiet tone of two sides who understood that the struggle had finally reached its final stretch. The result of these meetings, these slow and sometimes uneasy conversations, would become what the world knows as the Treaty of Nanjing, a document that would reshape the relationship between Britain and China for many years to come. Before we step into the details of the treaty itself, take a slow moment to picture the setting. Imagine late summer in the old city of Nanjing, the way warm air hung low, the stillness of wide stone streets, and the river drifting by with barely a ripple. Envoys from Britain arrived with stacks of papers, quiet clerks, and small groups of guards. Chinese officials came with their long robes, their measured steps, and their deep understanding of the weight of tradition. Both sides knew that history was quietly waiting at the edge of this meeting, watching every word, listening to every phrase, but they carried on with steady composure. The treaty was signed on August 29, 1842, a date that slipped into the record books without much noise, yet marked a turning point that the world still reflects on today. The first and most well-known condition of the pact was the cession of Hong Kong Island to Britain. The words were written calmly, but the meaning was heavy. Hong Kong, a small island with deep natural harbors and a sheltered position, had become a strategic place that British leaders deeply valued. For China, giving it up felt like letting go of a small piece of the coastline that had always felt like part of its own body. In the quiet hall where the treaty was laid out, men dipped brushes into ink and wrote with care, forming lines that would echo across generations. The cession of Hong Kong marked the start of a long chapter in which the island would grow, change, and take on a life very different from the shores that surrounded it. But on that gentle summer day in Nanjing, it was simply a name on a page written in slow, deliberate strokes. The treaty also listed what were called treaty ports, a soft-sounding term that covered a major shift in trade. The agreement opened 5 Chinese ports to British merchants: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. These ports would allow British goods to enter more smoothly and British ships to anchor legally, instead of waiting offshore or relying on complicated restrictions. This change, written in quiet lines on paper, unfolded into a wide doorway for Western trade, not just for Britain, but later for other nations who would ask for the same rights. The ports would become places where cultures touched, where new goods arrived, and where the old rhythms of Chinese coastal life began to mix with the habits of foreign traders. Another part of the treaty set a payment China had to make to Britain. It was presented as compensation for lost opium, damaged property, and the cost of the war. The number was large, and though today those numbers blur under the long shadow of time, at that moment they felt heavy on the empire's already strained finances. Chinese officials, weary from conflict, agreed, knowing that refusing would only lengthen the struggle. The money, once gathered, made its way across seas, while China quietly tried to steady its economy again. There was also a gentle-sounding clause about most favored nation status, a term that simply meant Britain would always receive the best trade terms available. This soft phrase, tucked inside the treaty's lines, carried big consequences. It meant that if China gave any special trade deal to another country later on, Britain would automatically receive the same. In a way, it created a chain that stretched far into the future, linking China's decisions to British interests and setting a pattern other Western powers would soon copy. As we drift slowly, calmly through this moment in history, it's important to remember that neither side viewed the treaty in the same light. For Britain, it was a victory, though not one carried with loud celebration. It was more like a quiet step into greater influence in Asia, a slow widening of doors that had long been closed. British merchants saw opportunity. British officials saw a foothold that could lead to deeper trade and larger profits. They returned home with calm pride, carrying the knowledge that the empire had extended its reach. For China, the treaty felt different. It was a moment of acceptance, a quiet recognition that the world outside its borders had changed faster than it could respond. Many Chinese scholars of the time saw it as the start of a difficult chapter, one in which foreign powers would gain more and more presence along the coastline. But even then, in those early days, the mood was not one of loud resistance. It was more of a deep, thoughtful silence, a reflection that filled courtrooms and families alike. Imagine Chinese officials returning from Nanjing, riding slowly along dusty roads, their minds heavy with the knowledge of what had been signed. They didn't speak quickly or loudly. They simply carried the truth back to the emperor, that the war had ended and the terms were fixed, and the nation would now move forward under new conditions. The emperor himself, sitting in the quiet halls of the Forbidden City, would have read the text slowly, letting the meaning settle like soft snow. He knew that the future would require patience, wisdom, and time. As Britain received news of the treaty, ships sailed homeward with calm satisfaction. The seas were gentler than they had been at the height of the conflict, and many sailors felt a deep relief as they approached British shores. Families waited for them. Fires crackled softly inside old cottages and townhouses, and the long shadow of war slowly lifted from minds on both sides of the world. Over the months that followed, changes drifted into place. British traders entered the new ports, meeting Chinese merchants with warm nods and polite exchanges. Goods passed between hands. Ships unloaded crates of cloth, metal, tea, and tools. And though the scars of the conflict were still present, The atmosphere began to feel more like early dawn than a heavy night. Each port grew busier, each harbor filled with more activity, and the meeting of West and East started shaping new rhythms of commerce and culture. Life on Hong Kong Island began to shift as well. What had been a small and quiet fishing spot slowly turned into a lively settlement. British officials built their offices on rocky hillsides. Chinese families stayed, fished, traded, and watched the changes with cautious eyes. Over time, markets grew, streets expanded, and boats of all sizes filled the water. But all of this happened gently, over years, not days, like a long tide rising quietly along the shore. Even though the treaty had ended the First Opium War, it did not settle every disagreement, nor did it erase the feelings of loss or frustration that still lived in many hearts. But it did bring a quieter time, a moment for both nations to breathe. The war had been like a slow storm, and the treaty was the soft clearing of the sky afterward, when clouds drift apart and leave a light glow on the horizon. As we close this part of the story, let the scene stay calm in your imagination. The peaceful signing hall, the gentle strokes of brushes across paper, the quiet movement of ships preparing to leave, the steady breath of nations stepping into a new chapter. And now, with that same soft quietness, we will move into the next part, where the long echo of this treaty spreads across years, leaving ripples that touch both Britain and China in gentle but lasting ways. After the treaty was signed, and after the ink dried on those soft, quiet lines that carried so much weight, a gentle stillness settled over the lands touched by the long conflict. It wasn't a sudden stillness, not like a door shutting or a bell ringing. It was more like a slow exhale after years of strain, the kind of quiet that spreads across water at dusk, soft and steady, giving everyone space to breathe again. As we drift into this next part of the story, picture that hush, that easing of tension, traveling slowly across seas, rivers, mountains, and old streets, reaching both Britain and China in its own gentle way. For China, the silence after the First Opium War felt heavy, but not chaotic. It was a stillness filled with long thoughts, long pauses, and long reflections. The Qing Empire, old and proud, found itself looking inward, trying to understand how a conflict with a distant island nation had cut so deeply. Scholars wrote quiet notes late at night, their candles flickering as they considered what had changed. Courtiers walked through the calm halls of the Forbidden City with slower steps, carrying messages and small scrolls that described the new arrangements created by the treaty. The emperor, surrounded by the soft rustle of silk robes and the faint echo of footsteps, had to think about how the world had shifted beyond his walls. Yet even in this quiet atmosphere, life continued with its usual rhythm. Farmers planted rice along the southern fields, fishermen cast nets into peaceful bays, and families moved through their daily tasks with care. Even though the war had touched many corners of the empire, most people still lived with the same simple habits they had known for generations. But underneath those familiar rhythms, there was a gentle awareness that things would not be quite the same again. Traders in the new treaty ports saw foreign goods arriving more often. British merchants walked along narrow docks, studying local markets with calm, curious eyes. And Chinese shopkeepers stood behind wooden counters, watching these newcomers with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and quiet patience. In the port of Canton, the changes were especially noticeable. The air, once filled mostly with local voices, now carried the sound of English being spoken in slow, steady tones. Ships with tall masts lined the harbor, their flags fluttering gently in the breeze. There was no anger in the streets, no loud disputes. Instead, the meeting of cultures took shape through soft exchanges, a merchant bowing politely, a sailor offering a friendly nod, a Chinese porter carrying crates while listening to foreign words drift over him like a distant melody. The war had ended, but people still needed rice, tea, cloth, tools, and salt. Trade moved forward with a quiet determination, like a river that keeps flowing no matter what storms pass overhead. In other ports, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Amoy, changes appeared with a similar calmness. Markets grew busier, docks grew more crowded, and the small inns near the water began to host visitors who looked and acted different from anyone the locals had seen before. Some travelers wrote letters home, describing China as a land of gentle rivers, wide fields, and ancient traditions. Others walked through the towns, looking at shops filled with porcelain, silk, and tea, marveling at how a place so old and steady had held onto its ways for so long. At night, lanterns glowed softly along the shorelines of these treaty ports. Their light shimmered across the water, casting reflections that moved gently with the tide. In these moments, the memory of war felt far away, like a dream half forgotten. Sailors from Britain sat on wooden stools, sipping mild drinks and speaking quietly about home. Chinese fishermen repaired their nets under the soft lantern light, humming old songs that carried across the docks. The meeting of East and West began to take shape not through declarations or conflict, but through small, calm moments shared beneath the open sky. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, Britain also felt the quiet that followed the conflict. The news of the treaty reached London slowly, carried by ships that crossed long stretches of sea, passing through storms and stillness until they reached British shores. When officials and merchants read the reports, they nodded with quiet satisfaction. The war had been costly, and the long voyages had tested many sailors, but the outcome had brought new opportunities. British leaders spoke in calm tones about the ports now open to trade, and about Hong Kong, the small island that would become a new foothold in Asia. Families of sailors and soldiers greeted their loved ones with relief. Many British men returned home after long months or years at sea, stepping onto familiar ground with tired smiles. They carried stories of faraway harbors, of warm nights in Canton, of misty mornings along Chinese rivers. But their voices were soft when they spoke of the war itself. The conflict had been real, but most of them preferred to talk about peaceful moments. The quiet glow of lanterns in Chinese towns, the sight of mountains rising in the distance, the gentle rocking of ships anchored along calm shores. In British ports like Portsmouth and Liverpool, crates of Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk began arriving more steadily. Dockworkers unloaded them with quiet efficiency, stacking the goods into warehouses where merchants would later examine them. Tea shops in London saw new varieties of leaves, allowing customers to enjoy fresh flavors with their late afternoon cups. People who had never seen China, never tasted its goods, or never imagined its coastal scenes, now found small pieces of that distant world resting gently in their own homes. Yet even with these new connections, Britain also felt moments of quiet reflection about what had happened. Some writers expressed mixed feelings about the war, wondering if the conflict had been the only path. A few people spoke softly about the cost of the struggle, not just in money or time, but in the lives shaped by addiction. But these discussions moved slowly, gently, without anger. The country had entered a new era of global trade, and most people were simply trying to understand what that meant for the future. Back in China, the quiet after the conflict carried a different weight. While many citizens accepted the new trade conditions with calm patience, others felt a soft ache, a sense of loss that lingered like mist on an early morning. Scholars gathered in small tea houses, their voices low as they talked about how the empire might grow stronger again. They studied maps, books, and writings from distant lands, trying to piece together how the world had shifted beyond China's borders. Some saw the treaty as a wake-up call, a gentle but firm reminder that the world was changing in ways they could not ignore. Still, life in much of China moved with the same slow rhythm it had always known. Farmers bent over rice fields under the warm sun. Children carried water in small wooden buckets. Elders sat outside their homes in the cool evenings, watching the sky turn from blue to pale orange to a deep, soft night. The empire was vast, far too large for one conflict to overturn its daily pulse. Yet here and there, in the quiet corners of towns and villages, people felt a small shift in the wind, a sense that new ideas, new goods, and new challenges were drifting in from the open seas. Lin Zexu, the official whose strong and steady efforts had once driven the fight against opium, lived the later years of his life in quiet reflection. Though he had been punished and sent away for his firm stance, he was still respected by many. In the calm evenings, he would walk slowly, watching the light fade across the horizon, perhaps wondering if the empire would one day find the strength to push back against foreign influence without violence and without losing its own soul. His name would later become a symbol of courage, but during those first years after the war, his world was filled with silence and thought, not glory. On Hong Kong Island, the quiet after the conflict brought changes that felt steady and measured. British officials built new structures, but the island still held the small fishing villages that had existed long before the treaty was signed. Waves brushed gently against the rocks, just as they had for centuries. Chinese families moved through their routines, selling fish, drying nets, cooking meals over simple fires, while British sailors and traders walked along the shore, listening to the soft hum of life unfolding around them. The island was becoming something new, but it still carried the calm spirit of the old South China coast. The lingering quiet after the conflict created a long pause in history, a moment when both China and Britain stood at the edge of a new chapter. Nothing changed overnight. Instead, the shift happened slowly, softly, like the gradual brightening of dawn after a long night. Trade increased. New ideas spread. Foreign influence grew in the treaty ports. And the Qing Empire, with its deep traditions and careful ways, began to face questions it had never needed to answer before. As you imagine this chapter, Let your thoughts drift like gentle waves across a calm sea. Picture soft lantern light flickering along distant docks and quiet voices carrying across the water. Think of farmers in wide fields, of merchants opening their shops at sunrise, of sailors returning home with stories whispered to their families by firelight. This was the world left behind after the conflict, a world touched by change, yet wrapped in a deep, thoughtful stillness. And now, with that same calm energy, we will move gently toward the final part of this story, where these long echoes of the past settle into the quiet reflections that still matter today. We have traveled far along the coasts of China, sailed with British ships, and moved quietly through the halls of ancient cities. We have seen misunderstandings grow, battles ripple across calm waters, and finally, the treaty that brought a delicate pause. Now, as we reach the last chapter of this story, let us linger on reflection, letting the past settle like soft sand beneath slow waves. After the Treaty of Nanjing, both nations faced a period of quiet adjustment. In Britain, officials reviewed the agreements, merchants prepared to trade more freely, and sailors returned to familiar harbors. Ships once heavy with cannon and tension now carried tea, silk, and porcelain, their decks filled with goods instead of gunpowder. The waters that had once carried the distant echoes of conflict now reflected the calm light of early mornings, the soft haze of evening, and the gentle rhythms of life resuming its natural flow. In China, the aftermath was both soft and heavy. Officials in the Qing court reflected on the lessons of the conflict, aware that foreign influence had grown stronger. Scholars wrote quietly, examining maps and texts to understand a changing world, while townspeople resumed their routines, watching the riverbanks, tending fields, and carrying on with daily tasks. Families had endured months of worry and uncertainty, yet now there was a pause, a moment to breathe, to consider how to move forward without panic, without haste, and with a sense of steady patience. Across the treaty ports, Canton, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Amoy, and Shanghai, life took on a new rhythm. British merchants walked among Chinese traders with quiet courtesy, exchanging goods and ideas, finding ways to navigate the delicate balance of commerce and culture. Goods that had been distant and foreign became part of daily life. Tea filled cups in new houses. Porcelain was placed carefully in shops and homes. Silk cloth changed hands softly, in the gentle pace of commerce. And through it all, children played along the riverbanks, the laughter of one generation carrying lightly over centuries, unaffected by the long shadows of diplomacy or war. Hong Kong Island, now under British control, grew slowly and steadily. Fishermen continued their work, nets moving like slow patterns across the water, while new buildings rose alongside the old villages. Streets widened, docks filled with ships, and the island began to take on a life that blended past and present. Even as trade expanded, the waves lapped gently against the rocks, unchanged by the changes on shore. In those soft moments, life carried on in its quiet, unhurried way, bridging two worlds without sudden interruption. In the broader scope, the First Opium War left a lingering awareness of how fragile understanding can be between nations separated by distance, culture, and expectation. Britain had used its naval power to achieve objectives that seemed simple to them: trade, recognition, access to ports. Yet the cost, subtle as it was, stretched far beyond the battlefield. China, proud and ancient, had faced a force it had not fully understood, and while the treaty restored some calm, it also signaled that the empire would need to adapt, reflect, and slowly reconsider its place in the larger world. The quiet lessons of this time are subtle, yet powerful. Misunderstanding and delay can ripple far, creating consequences that neither side ever truly desires. Small choices, made over months and years, accumulate into moments that shape history. And yet, as we look closely, we see resilience as well. Families rebuild, markets reopen, ships sail again with calm purpose, traditions persist, and the human rhythm continues, soft and steady, even when the world beyond the horizon shifts in ways that cannot always be controlled. It is also worth noticing that even in conflict, or immediately after, there are glimpses of connection and shared humanity. British and Chinese officials learned slowly to navigate each other's expectations. Merchants exchanged courtesies and goods. People observed and adapted. Even the sailors who had carried the sound of cannon and orders along the coasts returned home with stories of landscapes, rivers, and mountains that were filled with quiet beauty. And over time, the treaty ports became spaces where learning, curiosity, and adaptation quietly flourished, all beneath the unchanging rhythm of the waves. In the soft light of reflection, it is possible to see the long arc of history bending toward understanding, even when progress seems slow. The events of the First Opium War, the battles along rivers and shores, the cession of Hong Kong, the opening of ports, all of these created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate effect. New generations in China learned about distant lands. British children grew curious about the East. Scholars, merchants, and travelers carried stories across oceans. And slowly, gently, the world grew more connected, not through sudden leaps, but through the long, steady flow of decisions, small and large, careful and deliberate. As we imagine the final years of those who lived through this era, let us picture them in quiet moments. A fisherman untangling nets along the Pearl River, the sun low on the horizon, lantern light flickering softly across water. A scholar reading by candlelight, tracing brushstrokes on a delicate scroll, reflecting on lessons learned. A British sailor walking slowly along a dock, listening to the hum of distant conversations, feeling the calm of the evening settle into his chest. Each one carried memory, history, and hope forward in their own measured, quiet way. Even the small details of daily life became threads in the tapestry of reflection. Lanterns glowed softly in towns and ports. Tea steamed in cups on quiet mornings. Silk cloth moved gently through market stalls, each fold and thread carrying traces of human effort and care. Porcelain dishes reflected the morning sun, carrying patterns shaped over generations. The world, after a long period of tension and struggle, had returned to a rhythm where small, quiet gestures mattered deeply. And as the decades passed, the echoes of the Opium War and the Treaty of Nanjing remained gentle reminders of how delicate peace can be, and how careful attention, understanding, and humility are needed in the connections between nations. It was a time when the soft ripple of decisions made by a few powerful people affected millions, yet it also reminded everyone that resilience, reflection, and the quiet rhythm of everyday life continue to shape the future in ways both small and lasting. Here, in the calm conclusion of this journey, we are invited to pause, to breathe, and to reflect alongside those who lived in that era. We watch the rivers, hear the soft clatter of everyday life, and remember that the world moves forward slowly, with careful, measured steps. The story of Britain and China over opium is not just a tale of conflict, but also of adaptation, endurance, and the quiet persistence of humanity across oceans and generations. So, as the soft evening settles around you, and your mind drifts through the gentle waves of history, let this story linger like a slow melody. Imagine the calm waters of the Pearl River reflecting lanterns in the evening, the soft steps of traders and officials, the quiet hum of daily life returning after long, uncertain days. And know that even in moments of tension and change, life moves on gently, carrying memory, hope, and reflection across the quiet seas of time. Thank you for joining me on this long, gentle journey through history. If you have enjoyed drifting along with this story, exploring the quiet currents of the past and the soft lessons it leaves behind, I invite you to subscribe. By subscribing, you will continue to explore these calm, reflective tales together, allowing history to unfold slowly and peacefully, bringing new discoveries into your mind at a gentle, relaxing pace. Your subscription helps these stories continue and ensures that together we can keep wandering through time, softly, thoughtfully, and with steady curiosity. So, if this journey has brought you a sense of calm, wonder, or gentle reflection, please subscribe and stay with us as we explore the quiet moments of history, where lessons linger like evening light and every story unfolds at its own pace, leaving you ready to rest, reflect, and dream.